Going live. Okay, we are live and recording. I am. We're waiting for Lawrence to join. I didn't realize he was going to join us, and I'm wondering if there's some feedback coming from somewhere. Are you hearing any feedback?
Yep.
Okay. Right. I don't have a horrible. Please bear with us. We're just playing with technology. You don't have any browser windows on your machine. All right. Bear with us. I'm just going to see if this. That is very, very disturbing. Okay. That's better. Or was it feedback from the mic?
Yeah, it was my phone.
Okay then. Cool. All right. It wasn't. Someone needs to turn down their speakers. Thank you very much, Julian. Appreciate the tech support coming from the community. For those of you who are joining us live, thank you very much for taking your time. Please say hello in the chat like everyone else. Maybe also share where you are calling in from. We have Iceland. Lucy from Iceland. I don't think we've ever had anyone live from Iceland. Kai's in Amsterdam. Brilliant. We have Denny in Belgium. An overcast Malvern in the UK. Brett. It's a bit sunny over here, actually, Daniel Brian. Hopefully the sun will spread for the rest of the UK for the weekend. And we have Ruslana from Munich. Excellent. Scotland. Excellent. Thank you very much. Mancunia. We have Leanne from the grand state of Mancunia. welcome. And Rosie's in boring Brighton. So we're waiting to see if Lawrence is going to join us because he looked like he was around, but I'm having trouble connecting. So we'll see if he actually pops up. In the meantime, got a poll here. It'd be good to see who is in the room. So if you can see, either if you are on a laptop to your left, there is a little link that says polls. Please share what best describes you. Are you a founder, freelancer, consultant, coach, or company of one? Which is kind of a catch-all, but some people just like that idea of being a company of one rather than being a freelancer. So choose the one that you feel most energized by. Be good to see who we've got with us today. I think we've had 128 people sign up. So there's a lot of people who are interested in branding of some description. Lots of founders and companies of one coming in. And on that, trying to get a feel for why you're here. We've got another little question as well. If you've already answered the first one, is like to tell us what are you doing here other than to heckle Anne and myself, and now Lawrence in his van, I think.
Hey everyone, sorry.
Wherever he is. Yeah, where are you, Lawrence?
I'm in a beautiful service station in the Midlands of the UK.
Yes, that is sexy startups.
I know.
The family is waiting outside while you get the job done now.
Yeah, they're in the rain with an umbrella.
It's not far from the truth. We got the wagon packed with stuff.
Oh wow, cool.
The kids are sick, so don't tell anyone.
Oh no.
No, they're not.
They're not sick.
They
Oh.
We're pretending.
Okay. Well, this is full on jeopardy. We have an internet connection from Nairobi to contend with. We have a man in a van to contend with, and I think I'm the only one with a stable internet connection. So let's see how this goes. But as always, a quick check-in. How is it in van life, Lawrence?
It's good. We're off for a week in the Lake District in the UK. So yeah, people, cars, motorways.
Are there a lot of cars on the road?
It's quite busy, yeah. It's just nice being out somewhere different. I think it's the first time I've left Sussex in 9 months.
God,
So,
be careful out there.
Yeah,
Mind the zombies.
But no, all good. Nice and warm. It's warming up here.
Awesome. Anne, how about you? How are you arriving?
I'm ready for a haircut. I haven't had a haircut in a year and a half, and every time I do these calls, I'm like, wow, like my hair, it doesn't even, like, it now drops from the screen. I feel like I could be a stand-in in Little House on the Prairie by now.
Wow, that's a blast from the past. Little House.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. You were talking about. We were talking earlier. You said that there's sometimes there's a electricity dropout, and you have to then switch to the generator. So we will, fingers crossed.
People are going to get,
electricity.
people are going to get a little bit of a wrong impression of Kenya. I mean, Nairobi is super, super urban, 6 million people, but where I'm at right now is 3 hours outside of the capital. So.
Oh wow! And you said it's raining season or just ending raining season?
Yeah, we've just had the end of the rains. Yeah.
Gosh, yeah. We seem to, well, we don't necessarily have single seasons anymore in the UK. It feels like everything in one day or 1 month.
Yeah. Well, I have to agree. Like, there's obviously the climate change impact here is huge, but you guys just have rainy season all year, right? Like from the Netherlands, where I'm originally from, there's just 365 days of rain. It sometimes feels like.
Yeah, you wake up, it might be rainy, it might be sunny. You're not sure. Just more chance now and again, even in August. Oh dear. Well, I am very excited to talk to you, and given our previous conversations, I'm very curious about this idea, particularly around personal branding. I think a lot of people here are also wanting to dive into that. So what we'll do is a quick intro, and then we'll start this all off. And as always, we really value your questions. So if you come with any questions, please either type them into the chat or use the Ask a Question feature that you'll see here on Crowdcast. Again, it'll be one of those menu items at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop, or if you're on a mobile device, it's usually just below the chat. So please post any questions there. And you can also vote questions up and down. So also check out the questions, because there might be someone's question that you really want to hear answered. So we'd love to get your engagement that way. Cool. Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good rain, wherever and whenever you are. This, again, is our Friday Fireside, brought to you by the Happy Startup School. And today we are going to be talking about personal branding, the non-icky way, and other branding type questions. We are so happy to be joined by Lawrence, because he's in a van. But yeah, Lawrence, the mobile Lawrence, but more importantly, Anne Miltenburg. How are you? How are you feeling about this conversation, Anne?
Yeah, great. I think this was very good. I really like skeptics. And so when you did a poll, Carlos, about how people feel about branding, and there were all these kind of, quite cynical responses and skeptical responses, and people with some maybe, some multi-layered feelings, let's call it that way, about brand. I was like, yes, excellent. Like, these are my type of people.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, and I kind of feel that, particularly for people in our community, there is this impression of the kind of the sage on the stage type guru feel, the influencer thing that just feels so. That's, for me anyway, linked to the whole idea of personal branding. It just really puts me off. I know, Lawrence, you have a relationship to personal branding.
Well, I think like a lot of people, when I hear that phrase, it makes me shudder a little bit, just because it feels like you're trying to create a persona of yourself that isn't true, and I know that's not always the case, but yeah, I think it's something we come up against a lot. I think with people we work with, that there's this feeling of, I should do this, I should have a brand, I should have a personal brand, and it feels like a big weight for people, and feels like a lot of work and a lot of, I don't know, shedding of identity and creation of a new identity. And so I think that's what we find a lot of people end up not doing much, because they face that fear of, how should I be? How should I show up? So yeah, I'd love to maybe dispel some of the myths about that today, because that's what interests me about this.
Well, we will go on a journey of exploring this topic and hopefully coming out the other end with a more powerful and better relationship with this phrase. But before we kick off, I think it would be useful to learn more about Anne. And so it would be nice maybe if you could start by just sharing a bit about yourself, a bit more context of where you are and how you got there as well. It would be really, really nice for people to have that story, that backstory to this. So, yeah, where would you like to start, Anne?
Well, it's always I guess from my voice, a lot of people find it hard to place my accent. So I'm originally from the Netherlands, but I watched way too much television, so sound a bit American. But I've lived most of my adult life outside of the Netherlands. I've lived and worked in about 8 different countries, from Korea to the US. And I'm currently in Kenya, so I've been living here for about 7 years now. And shamefully still can't even order a cup of coffee in Swahili, so that's something I should work on. But I was originally educated as a designer at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in the Netherlands. And that set me on a journey that kind of, I guess, ended up in Kenya. And I'm happy to dive into that if people want to hear more of that backstory.
Well, yeah, no, I think we're there. Please, it'd be good to find out more.
Yeah, so I guess this probably resonates with people from the Happy Startup School community. But yeah, I became a designer because I thought it would be an interesting job that would allow me to address some of the big issues that I saw in the world. And I ended up graduating on a research project in Mali in Africa on visual illiteracy. So people who aren't raised or educated within like an environment with lots of text and visual communication, they often can't read and write, but they also can't read or write images. And so that was a really interesting experience for me. It was my first Africa experience. And in that space, I designed a healthcare campaign and grew really quite disillusioned with the development space and the kind of all kinds of really difficult systematic issues that I saw there. So when I came back to the Netherlands after my graduation, I was offered a job in a really great branding agency. And I thought, yeah, I'll take that. For me, it was like the step into the commercial world was actually felt very clear and clean. And like, yeah, there's no smoke and mirrors. There's no, false pretense. So there's no kind of hidden agenda. It's just very clear, like, we're selling something and we're going to do that in the best possible way. And I really enjoyed that work. I started as a designer, later became a strategist, and finally I worked as a creative director at a global brand agency called Interbrand. But I still was, my heart was still really engaged in all these social justice issues, and was very concerned about climate change, and grew like increasingly frustrated with my work. And I realized like there's amazing things that as brand strategists we do. We can get a lot of people to, run for products and services that, maybe they need or maybe they don't need, but anyway, they're not really that important to the world. And so I asked myself this question, like, hey, can my profession, can this expertise of brand, can it help to address some of these big issues? And when I started looking at the world through that lens, I realized like, oh, wow, there are so many amazing initiatives like products and services for change in the world, but they sell themselves very poorly. So they often, they often just don't get that kind of, big audience that they deserve. And that led me to quit my job and go on this 1-year research journey past co-working spaces in Ireland and Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Zambia, finally ending up in Kenya and speaking to all these change makers and entrepreneurs around the world to ask them what was holding them back from building a stronger brand. And my initial assumption was that people would say, well, I don't have the budget, or I don't have maybe the connections. But very surprisingly was that actually people were missing a lot of information about brand, and they were missing the skills. And I'd always thought like, okay, well, I can just switch from being, doing brand projects for big clients, to doing brand projects for change makers. And then I realized, well, if I really want to make a dent in this issue and help social entrepreneurs to really sell the change that they want to see in the world better, then it's not about being that consultant that works with, like, let's say 2 or 4 clients a year, but starting an education company that helps to train people in these skills and this way of thinking. And then when I was looking at, okay, where are a lot of change makers in the world, my eye was caught by Nairobi, which is, I think, unknown to a lot of people in Europe, but it's this amazing kind of the capital of social innovation and tech. And I got a teaching job there at an amazing school called the Amani Institute, where they teach social innovation. So they were kind of one of the first to say, like, oh yeah, maybe, yeah, we'd like to teach all of our people how to think more like brand strategists. So that was a bit of an anchor for me. And then I got a first client and a second client in Nairobi. And that's where we ended up starting the company.
Well, cool. There's that thing, the journey of trying to amplify your impact, it sounded like, from going from just working one-to-one with people to how can you empower more and more people. Something you said there, I'd be curious to hear from people in the audience, is like people's, all right, so this is for everyone listening and watching. When you hear the words selling yourself, what does that bring up to you in terms of thoughts and feelings? Please type a word or a phrase in the chat when you hear the idea of selling yourself. I think
it's interesting that you picked up on that, because I very deliberately use that word, because I think we have all these kind of, I think especially people who are interested in social change, like they think selling and like everything brand and marketing and selling is yucky. And so I actually like to kind of immediately put the finger on the spot where it hurts a little bit. But I know other people within our community prefer to switch self or better present yourself or getting more people on board. Like there's different ways, of course, of talking about it. But I like to be a little bit annoying to others sometimes.
Oh, it's good to poke the underbelly of people now and again, just to make sure that they're awake. There's this thing. One thing I picked up on, I think, because Lawrence is very good at this, and he's done this with the Happy Startup School. There's something, on my guess, there's something about being a designer and being able to, whether it's sell yourself, present yourself, or maybe it's about communication, that seems to be connected. And I want to just explore a bit of that in terms of how much of that is important in this idea of presenting or communicating.
Do you mean how much is like a natural ability important, or? Yeah,
a natural proclivity, or even caring about it. I think maybe there's an intention, because I think there's some of us who are less design oriented or don't consider ourselves designers in inverted commas. Find it more challenging to think about that aspect, because I think there's something visual, emotive, and as well as language.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a group of people in the world who are kind of inventors, and they always say, well, don't put the inventor in the shop. And I think it's quite rare to see people who are kind of both inventors as well as salespeople, as well as business people as well as. So I think that is quite unique. But unfortunately, unless you are able to kind of combine those different talents in a team and you have those team members on board, I do think, unfortunately, you do have a certain responsibility to your own success to ensure that you sell yourself, for at least as well as you deserve. And I think there's a lot of different ways to go about that. But yeah, and it's interesting, because I think if you come at it from a designer's background, it seems like it might have an advantage. But in my experience, actually, you have been trained to do it for other people. So, and in Netherlands, we say at the plumber's house, the taps always leak. So I find it actually quite difficult as someone with a brand strategy background to develop my own brand strategies. And you experience that across all sectors, right? Like you'll work with an accountant and their admin is a mess. Can't find their bank account. And I think that's also quite similar. So we have quite a few creatives who work with our method with their own clients, and time again, I see how difficult they actually find it to sell themselves as well. So yeah, I guess that's just a quirky part of the skill set, is like inability to switch the mirror around on yourself.
How about you, Lawrence? I think this is something that's alive in us at the moment in terms of this idea of the brand.
We're actually having someone help us, or people help us with that a little bit. Actually, reminds me of when we were building websites. We actually had a web designer come in and build our own website for that exact reason that you highlighted. Was we couldn't agree. It was too easy to keep changing your mind. All the reasons why we used to get frustrated by our clients were the reasons we found it difficult to make decisions about our own marketing and positioning. So I just think it's human nature, isn't it? We're really so close to something. It's hard to make decisions on something when we don't have that perspective. But yeah, going back to your point, I think Carl's made a good point there. I think people think of designers or even maybe brand people as a visual way of communicating. But like you said, Carl, like words are important. How we communicate is important. I always think Basecamp, one of their books, they said this: copywriting is design. How you craft your words is design in terms of how you communicate with people, how you write an email to someone, how you do customer service. All these things I think are touch points with people, and I would hope that was one thing people learn, is how it's not just about how you sell, but how you do everything is selling. Like Anne said, I think you're selling your ideas every day, probably 100 times a day. So I don't think it's bad to use that word.
To sell is human, is that right? Apparently, Chris is having trouble hearing you, Lawrence, so you may have to shout into your phone a bit more. Okay, sorry. That's okay. So there's a question here from Leanne. I thought might be a good intro or a stepping stone to some of the deeper conversations we're going to have about this. And she asks, what are the key differences between developing a brand for a company and developing a brand for a person? Discuss. Who was it? Go then.
Yeah, well, there's a number of differences, I think, but increasingly, of course, companies like to behave as people and be as personable as possible. So those boundaries are definitely melting. We have people who are one-person companies that are trying to look much bigger. But I would say that, so basically the way that when we talk about brand, the way that we describe it is like, hey, brands are very much like humans. So the anatomy of a brand is really about like having your vision, your personality, your soul, like on the inside, well defined, and then your like the next layer is your identity. So that's the physical expression of it. So that's what you look like, what you sound like, and then there's all the interactions, so you and your audience. And when you think about brand through that lens, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you think about it for a company or a person. The only difference with thinking about organizations or companies is that they have often a lot more stakeholders involved in terms of defining the brand. And when you have multiple people, of course, it becomes much more of a matter of like how brand drives culture. Whereas if it's a brand for a person, it's really much more also about your personal kind of creating your personal North Star and defining a little bit what's very obvious to you maybe, or less obvious maybe, but something that you have to codify. And so I think that's usually where in the process we see differences, but the similarities are very much about, for whether you're an organization or a person, it does involve quite a bit of soul searching. So understanding like, okay, well, what is the world that we want to see? How are we going to get there? What are the values that are going to be driving our behavior and our action? What are the things that we're promising to commit to our audiences? And then how do we translate that into a visual and verbal identity that really represents us or me? And how do you then bring that out into like a myriad of different experiences? And I think the second thing is when you're thinking about the difference between people and companies, at the end of the day, it's really also about who's your audience, right? So that's, again, there's a lot of similarities there, whether you have a company with a number of different audiences, or you're one person and you have a number of different audiences. You're going to have to do your research and really understand, like, hey, who are the people that I'm trying to reach? What do I need them to think and feel about me in order to become or stay involved with us? And that process can be very similar, whether it's just you in your basement or 500 people at headquarters.
Nice. Lawrence, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, what Anne said. I mean, it's. I think the underlying principles feel the same, and I think that, like the way you talk about it, there's a process there. I think it's what a lot of people don't understand. Is it feels like for a lot of people it's me and that person, or me, me as a company and those people, and there's just a big void of maybe knowledge or understanding of what that process could look like. So I think even just the way you've broken it down, it's helpful, because I just play with this stuff, because some people might not know exactly who their audience is at the beginning, particularly if they're starting out. But understanding who would I actually love to work with, like you said, who do I have empathy and understanding for already that I can maybe start communicating with. And so I think it just gives it a sense of play, maybe a chance to experiment too if you're at the early stage, rather than waiting till I'm established and then I invest in this stuff, which people think they have to do.
There's
that's a very I think you touch upon 2 points. I think there's 2 things that people often that we see kind of misunderstood. Well, there's many things misunderstood about branding, but this is also one that, like, I really see the brand journey as like a set of experiments and prototyping. So the days like when I first started in this field like 17 years ago, we were still printing brand books and like ordering 2,000 copies for a big corporate, and that book would be on the shelf for 10 years, right? But these days, because of the products and services are developing so quickly, the brands are evolving much quicker. It's much more a living, breathing thing. So there's so much that you learn, especially if you're still building a product or service. You're going to learn so much about your audience, what problems they're facing, how you're addressing those issues, the different ways that you're going to be able to reach them and engage them and kind of keep them involved over time. So it's kind of, it's a little bit short-sighted to think of it as like, okay, I'm going to do this at the end, and then it's going to be this 2-month process, and then we have some assets, and then we're done. And I can move on with my life because my brand is in place. So we always say, like, invest just as much time in growing and nurturing your audience as you are in actually creating a product and service, and like do them in parallel, right? So there's, I think this idea that we'll do it at the end is a shame, because a lot of the lessons that you're learning during the product development, you can then easily apply to the brand development and vice versa. So as you're learning more about your customers and more about yourself, you're kind of constantly updating as you go along. So I think that's also, hopefully that gives people the courage of like, okay, I don't have to put something out there that's perfect. We're just on this journey, and I'm going to make it lean and simple, and just take little steps as I move forward.
Well, there's I was going to say, there's the way you described it before. It made complete sense as a broken down set of steps or approach. But for me, and I'm wondering further, it still feels very overwhelming. It's like, who are you gonna? What are they doing? Who's your? Even just the idea of who's your audience. It's like, I don't know. It's like, and then the idea of iterating, experimenting is like that. And I think someone mentioned it when we were talking about sales. Is like this feeling of imposter syndrome, and this feeling like, is this good enough, or what will people say, and how's that going to affect me? And there's a whole mix of emotions of like, there's the process, and then there's actually the human experience of it. And I'm curious, particularly lending itself, focus more on the personal branding stuff rather than the company stuff, and I'd like to explore the company stuff at some point. But with the personal branding stuff, it's like, it's scary. It feels scary anyway, just to start putting out these little experiments of myself.
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Well, so maybe one of the things to keep in mind is that, like, again, there are some dysfunctional ideas about brand that are all about, okay, if you build a personal brand, that's like, someone I think in a WhatsApp group said, like, plastering yourself all over social media, or like, putting yourself first or making yourself look better. But in my personal experience, like, I'm certainly not someone who has a rocking personal brand, but I kind of know what I need to do in order for me to run our business and our movement, and having a sense of like, yeah, for me at this point, this is enough. But what I think is really helpful is when you think about it much more about like, okay, who am I looking to serve? How can I help them? And so that the pressure is less on like you and what you need and how you need to look, and what, and projecting this image of success, and just being very open and honest. Like, for instance, hey, maybe you're making a career switch and you kind of want to be recognized as someone who is moving from the accountancy space into the wildlife conservation space, like a totally weird twist. And then I think it's great to say like, well, okay, I'm on this journey to find out more about the sector, and I'm going to do that by asking lots of questions, and people are going to know me as this person that is exploring this new space. So I think letting go of some of those stereotypes, and also closing Instagram every now and then, where you're bombarded by people pretending to live the good life. I think that's really a good practice. And also maybe finding some examples of people that you really respect professionally, that you think have built a thoughtful brand that is much more aligned with your own values, and maybe your own introvertness or your own modesty. Yeah, I think those might all be ways to kind of relieve some of that pressure. And also recognize what Tim is saying about having this tendency like, well, I'm an introvert, and therefore I'm going to, it might be easier to put a business front in front, because that means that I have to do less of the selling myself. Which I recognize, and it's also actually a tip that some of the introverts in our community sometimes share, like, yeah, if you're afraid, create a business brand. But it can be a bit of a Band-Aid situation sometimes, because at the end of the day, it's still you. But it's now kind of, you've put in an extra speed bump for people to kind of discover like, okay, but do I trust this company? And now I'm going to look at the people behind it, and hey, there's, they're going to end up with you at the end of the road anyway. So finding a way that you're comfortable in building your brand, I think, and surrounding yourself with examples that you do love, I think is helpful.
There's so one of the kind of ways of looking at business building that I've been playing around with is this kind of a spectrum of artist versus entrepreneur. And the way I define that, the entrepreneurial approach is I look for a gap in the market, an opportunity, and I see how I can take advantage of it and how I can serve that demand. And then the artist's end for me is that I just want to make this thing. I just want to express myself, and I don't care, in inverted commas. It isn't for anyone else. This is for me. So when I think about this idea of branding, there's this aspect of who do I want to serve? What is it I need to show in terms of the values and the image that resonates for them? But then there's this other aspect of who am I? What is it that I actually care about? What is it that and the way I was trying to think about it, how is it I want other people to see me, in a sense, or how would I like people to see me as my real self? Not because I'm going to sell them anything, not because it's going to make a change, but that fundamental level of like, what's my starting point? And I was curious about how not knowing that can be a challenge when you, like you were saying before, like you're building this brand because it's a business brand or the face that you want to show to people, but actually how much of it is me and how much is behind it. Do you see where I'm going with this? I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Well, I think for a lot of people, there's a question, I guess, about how much of myself do I show and how much of the business do I show. And I think that's really different depending on the industry that you're in. So if you think of a personal brand purely as a professional brand, let's say, then I imagine there's a very different kind of tolerance for amongst different audiences and amongst the professionals themselves of what you actually show. I'm not sure if
well, I think where I'm coming from is there's this, I hear a lot, bring your whole self to work, be an authentic founder, bring, show vulnerability, and how that now sits with this idea, right, what you were saying before, and I think Chris just said it, your personal brand has to not about you, but about your audience. Cool. And I totally get that. But then there's this other aspect of like, okay, who is this person? Because we're trying to build trust in the person that's going to serve us or help us or be on this mission. And so that's where I start getting a bit lost, because on one level, how much of this personal brand is me and how much is it something I need to create in order for people to understand this mission I'm on or this organization is on?
Yeah. So have you ever seen that video of the guy dancing at the festival? I'm sure you guys have seen that video, right? And you have, what do you need to do in order, well, he's not even trying. Like there's a guy who's doing a funny dance and obviously people are looking at it going like, this guy's crazy. But then after a while, like a very daring person stands up and it's like, okay, yeah, I'll mimic that. I'll dance with this guy. Now you've got your first follower, and then you've got your third and your fourth, etc. Right? So for me, if I just look at my own personal journey, for me, what was really important was like I asked myself this question of how can I create a world where a family that's starting a fair trade lemonade brand could rival a company like Coca-Cola. And I am going to, I have to position myself as like an expert in the space of branding. My interest is social enterprise. And so how do I put that mission into the world? So the first idea is like, okay, well, we're going to, I'm going to start creating tools and resources, books and courses. And I'm going to talk about like, these are all the ways that, all the problems that we see. These are the things that we think people need to know, and we start honest conversations and get people to follow along with this idea that we should all sell ourselves better to the world. I think what you see is like all those things are authentic expressions of myself, but they don't necessarily, I don't know how to be unauthentic or very authentic. It's just, I guess it is what it is. But I don't sit behind my laptop in the morning and think like, oh, which failure should I send out in the world today so people find me more authentic, right? And I think one of the things that's very dangerous about the vulnerability theory is vulnerability is proven scientifically to work if you've already established your credentials. So for instance, they've taken job application processes and looked at research and said like, okay, well, who are the people who benefit most from appearing vulnerable in the application stage? And that's all the top applicants. So the top 10 people are already like on the list of like, yeah, these are the people that we would potentially hire. Those people benefit from saying like, I have some doubts about this or that. But for the other 90%, that isn't always working. So I think this whole, you gotta be your full quirky self thing is a little bit, like, yeah, I think there's definitely a limit to how much of your personal life and your personal stuff people are willing to tolerate. And I think, again, it's different per industry. But I would be definitely careful and just taking that as a kind of given.
Cool. Yeah, I think I remember there's, I don't know if Ellen is here. She hosted a crowdcast about bringing our authentic selves to work. And sometimes my authentic self is the last thing I want to bring to work because it's going to rub people up the wrong way. But there's something here.
No, just about talking about that whole thing of, how am I going to show up, being vulnerable? I was just thinking that I think in some ways, is it about getting out of our own way rather than thinking, how do I want to be seen? How do I want to be perceived? More just I have some ideas I want to share. I'm the messenger for that. If I put up a block for myself, then actually I'm stopping whoever it is I'm trying to serve from receiving those ideas. So I'm just wondering if is there something about, like you talk about working with change makers, there's something that they're trying to do, something that they're trying to change. You know, can we help them think about, actually, you're the person, it's your responsibility here to share these ideas in whatever way you can, being yourself in the process, but not trying to craft something too clever that ends up seeming inauthentic when it's delivered.
I think where I'm at now is this idea of oversharing, and it's just being conscious about why are you doing it, and also conscious about what's making you, what's triggering you to react and say things in a certain way. Because I think there's, on one level, if we're just doing it because it's kind of like trying to do therapy in public, I think that's irresponsible. But I think there's something here around, why am I on this mission? Why am I doing this work? Why is it that I want to connect with these people? And maybe to be super clear, is like, I got this image of the martyr. It's like, I need to fix the world. Yeah. And the reason I want to fix the world is because I'm hurting inside. But I don't know that. It's just, I think if I fix that, then I'll be okay, because that'll make me feel good. And so how that lack of awareness maybe can, for me, starting to link into this idea of like understanding how I'm presenting myself and the mission I'm on. Does that make sense in any way?
Yeah, I think it does. I think that, I mean, I get the sense from also the messages in the chat that that's what people very much feel.
And this is where I think, my perception, and this is, again, maybe where I'm coming from personally, but I'm wondering if there are people out there who are trying to work out, okay, I want to be able to talk about what I'm interested in and how it aligns to the work that I do in a way that feels like flow, yeah? Where I'm not always filtering. I'm not always second guessing, is this the right thing to say? Should I write this? Should I do that? But at the same time, I'm not going full other end of just verbal diarrhea of like, oh, this is what I'm thinking today, and I'm just going to write it because I think it's authentic. There feels like a balance or a process, and this is where I was trying to get to. Maybe we can talk a bit more of how do I use some of that to then be of benefit to the work I want to do or the change I want to make.
Yeah. So I think if you're thinking of, like, if you think about authenticity, that's obviously a big topic right now. But I think it can also be a great source of misery for people, that already, like, if you're starting a one-person business and everything needs to come from yourself, and now also your personal story and your personal successes and failures need to be at the heart of everything you do. That's that's a very tough uphill battle for people who simply don't care to be at the center of everything. So when what we see, for instance, when people come into a program with us where they develop a brand, what I often see with people who are solo entrepreneurs, for instance, they have had some kind of aha moment, like there's a problem that they've signaled in the world, and there's some kind of insight, like, hey, this is something that I could be doing something about. And that's really where we start the brand process. And we follow that kind of journey about the insight that you've had, and what's the proposition, like what's the product and service that you're actually trying to create? Who could be the audiences for that? Let's start with a couple of assumptions the first time around, right? And then we look at, okay, well, what's the market for that? And how do people make choices between the different options that they have? And so, like, none of that still has anything to do with your authentic self-expression. That has all to do with, I guess it's very comparable to like market research and business development, right? And so when you get to that point where you say, like, okay, now I have a good idea of like what's somewhat my product or service, what is a little bit my audience, now you can think about the bigger picture, like, okay, well, what's that world that we want to create, and how do we want to bring people along with that? And what do we believe on the inside, and how we're going to bring that out into the outside? But very important in that process every time is saying like, okay, well, who's the audience? What do they need to think and feel in order to come on board with this proposal? Whether that's like, you know, a human rights campaign or a muffin shop down the road. And just having a very clear understanding of like, hey, this is what we're about, but this is what the problems and joys in our audience lives are, and how can we get them involved, right? And so I think this personal brand and this idea of authenticity is actually overshadowing the whole strategic process and the research process and just the prototyping aspect of the brand. And it's a little bit, yeah, it's I can imagine it's very frustrating for people sometimes because we form an image of brand based on people who we don't like. So it's a little bit like saying like, well, I'm not going to start a business because I know a ton of businesses that are, you know, just awful capitalist, greedy pigs, bad service. Like, so I'm not going to, you know, and I think that's really important. Like, well, you know, you can hate how other people do it badly or poorly or selfishly, but don't throw away the whole concept because some people are just kind of, you know, expressing it to the world in a way that makes you queasy.
I liked what you said there about there's an insight. So, there's something. Could you maybe give an example of what kinds of things that you've seen people have in terms of that insight that then motivates them to do something?
So, for instance, in the Netherlands, about 15 years ago, there was a journalist who started, he had a TV show, and he had this, found out during research that there's a lot of slavery involved in the chocolate supply chain. And so he came up with this funny idea like, hey, why don't I try and make a chocolate bar that's 100% slave-free? And he realized during that process that it was actually impossible to create a slave-free chocolate product. And when they were doing, when the show was aired, they realized that there's a lot of people in the Netherlands who were concerned about this issue and who really loved chocolate, but didn't want to eat it because of this really problematic issue of slavery within the supply chain. So there's this moment where you say like, okay, people want to eat something great without like slavery leaving a bad taste in your mouth. And we're going to start a brand of chocolate bars that is going to combat slavery in the supply chain and, you know, be a lovely, great brand along the way. And they started with a prototype of like, you know, a couple of chocolate bars in a cafe. And now they're the biggest chocolate brand in the Netherlands, and they're available, I think, in 9 different countries. And so this idea that you can actually, you know, from a aha moment that maybe not even be on the search of a business, you can build something. Another example here in Kenya, there a guy called Roshan Paul and a lady called Lana, they realized when they were working in the social impact sector that there wasn't really anyone who is educating people to change the world. So there's a lot of people who come maybe from a business background or international development background and who want to do something good in the world, but there's no one teaching them actually the skills that you need in order to do that. And so they decided, okay, let's start an educational institute that teaches people all these social innovation skills. So I think people have, you just have people in the world, and probably it's many more than we think, who have this like aha moment or like, hey, wait a minute, there's something that there's a need here that's not being addressed. And that's where we start that kind of journey of thinking about a product or a service or a company. And that's where kind of in my experience, the branding starts.
So Lawrence, what was our aha moment?
I was thinking actually, I remember when we...
Closer to the mic, Lawrence.
Oh, sorry.
Press your face against your phone.
Can you not hear me? Is that better?
That's better.
Okay. Apologies for being too close up. No, I was thinking like we did a meetup very early on in our Happy Startup journey, which was probably a prototype when we look back. And one of the things that kept coming back from people who were applying for that meetup was they just kept saying, I'm here to meet like-minded people. And that just kept coming back, like-minded people. And we hadn't really thought of starting a community. We were just sharing ideas, but this feedback that we were getting was people want to connect with people who share their values around business. And that was maybe a little bit of an aha moment for me to go, okay, there is an interest in bringing people together, not just to learn, but to connect. And so I think that made me think that we're onto something here.
So there's an element for me, even a bit before that, is when we released the Happy Festo, and essentially it was not so much an aha moment, but just the coming out in terms of like, this is what we think business should be about. This is why we do our work, and this is how we think it should be. And then that was that journey of like, okay, then how does this actually turn into something? And so I think there's on one hand, because when we started, I don't think we knew there was an audience. We weren't actually on the hunt for an audience. We were just saying, this is kind of the way we want to work. And then through that, we kind of started to find people who resonated with our message. And over that time, we've kind of iterated on the different ways that we could work with them, whether that's through events, through courses, and now much more through kind of group coaching. But it was very much an emergent path rather than a strategy. And I think what way I understand, we benefited from Lawrence's kind of eye for aesthetics and storytelling to start sharing that message, which I think links to what you're talking about, Anne, in this idea of like, how do you talk to people in a way that motivates them to get on board, which I think is the danger of going too much the other way of like, this is all my crap, I want to share it with the world because it might connect with people. But I think some of that was like, we really didn't feel we could survive in the corporate structure or that growth for the growth's sake way of building businesses, and we still trying to work out what it means to build a business. But on the other hand, there was this really positive message of like, how can we bring a bit more happiness, values, doing work we love, community to business, and what does that mean? And so yeah, there's that for me, there's that, I think, interplay between personal needs and personal mission, or an inner insight as well as insight about the outside world, and then how you actually make that happen, which I feel is very much what I've learned from you in terms of that process, really, of them making it work.
Yeah. So what you're describing, or at least what I'm hearing you say, is that like the way we track the process of brand building is actually, so it's cyclical. So you start with a sensing phase and a research phase. Then you start thinking like a brand strategist, like, okay, well, I have all this research on like, what's the problem? What are the other offers in the market? How could I position myself? Who might my audiences be? And then you start thinking like a brand strategist, like, okay, well, and then, what is my brand going to be all about? What do we stand for? How do we bring it out into the world? How are we going to reach people? And then you're starting to think about implementation. And so what Lawrence is saying, like, okay, well, we put something out, like we put our manifesto out, and now we have a first set of people who are giving us like the response, like they're in a way feeding this insight of like, people are missing a space to connect with like-minded people who share their values about starting kind of, living a different life or having a work that you love. And now you're going to think better about like, okay, well, maybe community is an interesting product or service, but now you've got to learn who's an interesting audience for people who are looking for community. And so you kind of like each cycle that you do, you're going to learn a little bit better about what your product or service is and who your audience is. And you're going to have that first person who's going to follow you when you dance, and the second person, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people keep coming. Like those could also just be the first funny nutcases who can read through all of your nonsense online and think like, I think she's very vague, but I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt. But once you've kind of worked through those kind of first like very friendly people, you'll probably hit a wall, because now that you've kind of exhausted your first circle of friends and connections, and you need to actually get it out to a group of people who don't know you personally and might not have as much, love and affection for you. Then the question really becomes much more like, okay, well, now we need a really good value proposition because people actually need to understand what it is that we do. I think especially in a space where people are working on innovative ideas. So I think community, like 5 or 6 years ago, that wasn't such an obvious proposition, right? So people like, you do what? Like, for who? Like, what? And so you really, like, it's a really hard, at the beginning, it's a really hard slog to figure out, like, well, what's actually the way that we can get people on board with this. And I think one of the most dangerous things that exists out there is that we kind of do like fingers crossed and wishful thinking, like we're going to launch something and people are going to tell each other about it and they're going to, you know, and it's going to be great. And it's like, oh yeah, like for 99% of us, that's just goes like, boom, boom, you know, flat line. And some of us might, you know, 1% might be amazing takeoff. But like this, like the idea, like I'm going to build something and then I'm going to hesitate to put it in market, but I'm going to put it in the market anyway and just cross my fingers and hope that it picks up. That's a really like, it's a bad way of spending my time. Like if I am trying to grow my audience and I'm trying to build my product at the same time, you're also de-risking, right? So you're actually thinking about it much more like, okay, well, what is a first little prototype that I can put out there and a first little brand experience? And so as you're moving along, I think you can do yourself favors by starting that brand process early.
There's been a lot of sensing, I think, and trying stuff on our journey. And this is like a journey of 10 years, I feel. And I think on top of that, there's also, for me, I think it's just feeding back on actually and understanding a bit more about why we're doing this. Because there's, from my perspective, there has been an evolution, not only of the brand and who we work with, but also why I think I'm doing this stuff and what excites me about this work. And its transition from building businesses and startup and just thinking about creating these new, wonderful, innovative businesses to actually the people behind them. And that becoming more, actually, that's where I want to play. And that's the story I want to tell. And that's where I want to double down. I don't know what you think, Lawrence, in terms of your own journey on this.
Yeah, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's sometimes a pivot on either the people or the position they're at. Me and Carlos have had lots of conversations around this. I think is, you know, we probably one of the reasons we started the Happy Startup School was we asked why far too much with the clients we were working with before, which ended up leading us to where we are now, where it wasn't always about business. Like you said, it was often about them as people and leaders. And yeah, that's what excites me, is working with people who have that influence, and the product, the brand, the company becomes easier to make decisions on when you know why you're making them as a leader. So yeah, that's, like you said, that's feedback, that's insights we've got from going on this journey with loads of people over the years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also, Lawrence, you once mentioned that like Happy Startup School in a way is no longer the right moniker, because there's a lot of people in the community who are no longer startups. Is Carlos like, oh, don't go there, don't open that can?
No, I'm happy to, in the spirit of authenticity, vulnerability, and oversharing, I'm very happy to go.
Yeah, well, and I think what is really great about like the overall insight that I sense in everything that you guys do is that a lot of places where people talk about businesses, they talk about business knowledge and business skills, but it has nothing to do with the psychology of the founder and all of the different things in, you know, part of your personality and your previous skills and your emotional life. There are all these, what's the word in English? So these things that hold us back from, you know, getting a business potentially up and running. And that could be, yes, okay, you're missing, you know, accountancy skills. Yes, okay, but maybe there's a bigger thing at play, and that's also why I think for a lot of people, for instance, in the brand process, it is a little bit like therapy. So when we run our programs, we have to say like, I'm not a therapist, but it's very commonly heard phrase. And yeah, I can imagine that at some point for you guys also, there would be a good question, like, are you selling that really well to the world? And is that something that people want to hear? Because I think this is where branding gets quite complicated, is that probably a lot of people like me, I would not have come to the Happy Startup School community if there was a sign above the door that said therapy, enter here. Right? I would be like, no. I'm here for this is my ask, and I need someone to help me kick the S out of this financial model. And then you end up on Lawrence's sofa, and you're like, oh, all these emotional hangups, and help me address some of the assumptions that I'm making over and over and over and over again, or all of these personal failures and mistakes that I just, as a founder, just can't seem to learn from. And that's always an interesting question, right? And that's something that you can test. So would people come in if there is not a Happy Startup School, but a therapy for business people sign above the door? Because you could basically also see it as this is what we call the Trojan horse brand strategy. Mm-hmm. Is that you package something one way, and inside is another surprise thing. So Happy Startup School could very well be the best possible wooden horse for the army of therapists inside. So you never know. It's the same way, how do you get meat eaters to try a vegan burger? You don't talk about animal welfare, you talk about the good taste. So this would be a very fun
You just killed our Trojan horse there, Anne.
Just giving away the crown jewels of our brand. I was talking about this to someone last week about how they come to summer camp for the hot tubs and they end up crying in a field with someone they've just met.
We're doing the best marketing now for our events.
I'm now getting abused by my kids.
Oh dear. I was wondering when we were going to get a little drama.
We're going to get in. Actually, I just wanted to maybe touch on this question from Marianne, which I think is kind of relates to this moving target, I feel, around the brand, the personal branding in general, and how to commit to this real key message. And she was asked, she loves the idea of iterating, but then the challenge at some point is to invest some money into it. And she can't afford to keep on getting design help all the time. So she's trying to, at what point do you start to commit to something? And as I understand it, decide on the brand or on the way. I don't know. Yeah. Any thoughts or reflections on that, Anne?
Traditionally, I would say when you found product market fit is the best time to make an investment, because now okay, the product that I offer is at the right price and people are buying it, and now it's a good moment to put some money against it, because when I push this lever, I know that it's actually going to start rolling for me. On the question of when I iterate, how do I do that financially? I would say the iterations don't necessarily need to be in design, because you also don't want to have a new logo every 6 months or a new website look and feel. But for instance, think about it as okay, I'm currently prototyping new product or service. What is the least I need out there in the world? So maybe that is only a Squarespace, website and a business card. And now I have a working title for this project. And as I'm iterating, okay, what is my next step? So maybe I now have my first customers. I'm learning something about those customers. Up to this point, I still maybe don't need that designer necessarily, right? So now I have some more info. So I would say try and invest most in the strategy in the first part, and then small prototype and grow from there, and see also if you can develop a long-term relationship with a brand strategist or a designer, someone who you trust and someone who you can come back to time and time again, so that for them also, hey, there's a reason to deliver really great work, and maybe you can come to a better agreement around price, for instance, so that okay, well, a couple of $100 a month, I'm going to invest in my relationship with this person, and they're going to give me X, Y, Z for that. But they know that this is a kind of recurring thing for them, and it might lead to better results and lower costs.
Lawrence, any thoughts? Can you hear us, Lawrence?
Yeah, you cut out a little bit, and so I didn't really get a lot of that, must admit.
Cool. It was, I think this
What was the
idea,
question? Sorry.
it was around when to invest more in brand. You know, there's this idea of like, okay, you can't be changing every few months. And I feel like with us, we have been on a journey of trying to find the stable business model, the product market fit that feels sustainable. But until then, it was very hard for us to invest too much money in rebranding.
Yeah, I think a bit around what said, maybe using some existing tools to help, do it yourself, as much as you can. Maybe the canvas that Anne's created and the book she's got. There's great tools like Canva and Squarespace now that you can use to at least get something off the ground. But the other thing is maybe any sort of skill shares. Like we've got people in the community who are helping each other with things that they're not so good at, and vice versa. So maybe there's someone who can help you with a brand in exchange for you doing something for them that they struggle with. But yeah, I think as much as possible, just don't let it hamper you from doing stuff, because I believe brand is as much what we do as what we say. So yeah, that would be my advice.
There's another question I thought we'd like to finish up on, because there's a lot of people who in our community who are transitioning. They've either had one business and they're moving to another business. They've had a career in a certain place and they're trying to explore something new. And there's this challenge, particularly on talking to the world. How do you do that? How do you then start talking about your new thing while you're still doing the old thing? And we had a bit of a discussion around this and before, so I thought maybe just finishing off on that. This moving, essentially reinventing, re-merging, just making that transition. Any kind of reflections or thoughts maybe to help anyone who's on that journey?
Yeah, I recognize it. I know a lot of people, like at some stage of their career, are considering a small switch or a huge switch. And one of the things I've noticed is that, yes, sometimes it's like a radical shift and has two things have nothing in common with each other. And it's really hard to imagine, like, oh, how am I going to kind of be believable in a new space, but I also maybe need to keep some income in the old space. And it's going to, like, I'm going to appear like, not good to my old clients, and I'm not going to look good to my new clients. What do I do? But what I often see with the people with that kind of profile that I've worked with before is that there is some kind of underlying theme beneath the two worlds. So that could either be, I'm going to make this switch and I'm going to apply, for instance, my previous professional skill in my new space. So for instance, I work with a company called Internet of Elephants. Their founder made the switch from a career in IT consulting to tech for wildlife conservation. And so initially that was like, oh, okay, well, how do you do that? But basically what he said is, okay, well, he's going to be applying kind of the tech and business mindset to the conservation sector. And even though he has no reputation in the conservation world for ever having saved a single elephant, but he does know about, like, what are the ways that IT and technology could help scale some of the ways that we protect wildlife. And so we're going to create a platform for him to talk to the conservation space about all the different ways that technology could help, for instance. So that's one way of looking at it. But I also think if there is not such a kind of connection between the two, it is still possible, but there is some underlying theme, right? There's a bigger theme underneath in your life, maybe that didn't emerge so much in your first part of your career, but is now re-emerging in the second. And I think it's totally feasible to think about, like, okay, well, for instance, is there an idea of serving or a sense of hospitality? We have someone in our current program who worked with food and is going into the mediation space, like helping companies come together and resolve conflict. And there's a hospitality theme in both. Like, how do you bring people together for good conversations? So there's something like in the underlying themes to explore. And if you're like, well, the first one doesn't apply to me, the second doesn't apply to me, there is a third option, which is you can just completely separate out your channels. You can say, okay, I'm going to be Mr. Business Consultant on LinkedIn, and I'm going to use, I have my business website, and I'm going to be, yoga, acupuncturist, something else on Instagram, and I'm going to have a different website for that. So there's different strategies, because or hopefully also your audiences will be very different. And at some point then you can say like, okay, well now I've built enough volume of clients to kind of shut the door on my previous job. And now I can start bringing people maybe from that world into my new world and sharing some of that journey. Some people are more open to experimenting publicly than others. And I think any strategy that makes the combination of, like, let's say, keeping some basic income with growing your new income possible is, of course, ideal.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I think so. That really playing into that underlying, or trying to find that underlying theme. And I think that's super important for people who we talk to on this kind of second mountain journey, where they are trying to reposition themselves on a more meaningful path, but at the same time trying to maintain a foothold in that past world, to maybe for financial reasons, if anything else. Great. Well, thank you very much, Anne. Really appreciative of your time, your knowledge, and your wisdom. For those of you who appeared live and shared your time with us, we're going to send you a little present in the emails, so look out for that soon after the call. Lawrence, any final words?
No, just really loved it. Any shameless plug for your program, Anne?
Yes.
Yeah, for those of you who are interested in going through a brand building process, we have a 8-week course where you work with me and 15 other participants, from personal brands to organizations to products, on the sensing stage, the research stage, the brand thinking stage, and part of the implementation stage. We're recruiting now. The course starts in September, and we have limited spots. So if anyone's interested.
And is there a link that we can share?
Yes.
It'd
be funny now, wouldn't it, if I said, like, we have no website up.
Is it the Brandling Academy?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, good. So we have the link in the chat there. Check it out if any of this resonates for you. Thank you very much again, Anne. Thank you, Lawrence, for vanning it with us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And as always, remember to follow us on Crowdcast. So click on the Crowdcast link at the top. Hey, Seamus. Hey, Arthur. If any word from them, they'll be also good in terms of kid branding. Hello.
Yeah, they're big branding experts, them too.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence, for joining us and stopping the whole family.
Exactly.
Keeping them proud.
Daddy's on TV.
Sorry, guys.
Awesome. Well, have a great holiday, Lawrence. Have a great weekend, Anne, and everyone else.
Thank you. You guys.
See you soon.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye.